and they don't care about how we define them. The threat and harm from Northern Ireland-related terrorism is inextricably linked to the enduring problem of paramilitarism in a wider context and in the wider context of organised crime. The lines are often blurred between those involved in terrorist activity and other forms of paramilitary activity and organised crime, and I believe you've heard quite a lot of evidence to suggest that. So just one final thing, but across this ecosystem, these groups and individuals involved cause harm to their communities in ways that are obvious, such as violent attacks, and in ways that are much less obvious, including intimidation and fear, to exert influence and control, essentially to try and remain to be relevant. And that's why we need to do all we can to remove their opportunities to do this.
Thank you. Let me pick up on a few of those points. There are things, as we know, that you will know in your position, that your colleagues will know, that we've been hearing about during this inquiry, which you would not tolerate taking place in Daventry. I would not tolerate taking place in North Dorset or any of us in our GB constituencies. I take it from what you have said, you will have no truck with the sort of slight defence argument of Northern Irish exceptionalism. Well, it's always gone on, we've always had it, we just have to sort of try and contain it rather than try and stamp it out completely.
No, but I do have an understanding of the history as to where we've got.
Oh, yeah.
So there's no exceptionalism at all. I'm with you on that. But it comes from a very different context, and I think trying to understand the context from which it flows is genuinely important to try and help crack this problem.
Can I turn to terminology? You'll be aware that we've heard from both the PSNI and the prison service as part of this inquiry, and we're alert to the organic process, if you will, of how the prison service is dealing with prisoners who are there on paramilitary/terrorist charges. The terminology that we use, there's a sort of vaingloriousness, isn't there, of paramilitaries, people who are working to either kick the Brits out or keep Dublin away. And in essence, these are thugs, these are drug dealers, they are destroyers of lives, they are child and young people groomers. Their work should, or their activities fall probably within the broader umbrella of safeguarding issues. There's nothing grand or brave about these people. These are intimidatory thugs. Do you accept that, and do you accept that if we move away from the sort of quasi-militaristic language which they're inclined to use to describe themselves, the wider community still more clearly sees them for what they actually are, and therefore makes them less relevant?
I can understand where the language has flowed from. I suppose it goes to my previous answer. You know, there's a historical context here that I personally would like to think is no longer relevant to modern day society in Northern Ireland, but some people do hark back to. And I suppose in some ways you could say it's the language used is a description of part of that. But I do completely understand your point, and I know you've talked about it quite a lot, about what these people are. And you cannot compare, and I've been caught out trying to do this, you cannot compare organised crime in London or Northamptonshire or whatever with these groups in Northern Ireland. They are subtly different, historically different, even though they might be doing the same things, and their network within society is completely different. But I do completely understand your point, how society might be rewarding them almost with military attributes that simply they don't deserve.
You've referenced the shooting of DCI John Corbell. There have, of course, been some other events in recent time which, of course, cause concern. Are you able to say a little bit about your assessment of the security level in Northern Ireland today? and your concerns, if any, about the possibility of an increase in paramilitary activity.
I mean, obviously the assessment of the security level is done independently of me, and rightly so, by other experts based on a whole host of evidence. So I haven't really got anything to say about that, but this committee will know it went down to substantial, was it
Last March.
Last March. So, and that was a welcome step, and that was based on amazing work that had been going on for a very long time by PSNI and its partners in this security space, who have been degrading the threats that have been emerging. It is true that we've had this shooting, and there was the attempted bombing of police officers in, I think, November the 17th last year by an IED, improvised IED. And we'd had, previous to that, a good period of time without such an attack. But in the assessment of the security threat, I mean, I think the official answer that I've heard many times, that this assessment is always being constantly looked at to see if it is the right level, and by those that I think do know what they're doing. But I have nothing much more to say than that. Sorry,
Mr. Crawford.
So I was just going to say, I think you heard from ACC McEwen in one of your previous sessions, just to reiterate, I think the point he made about the statistics of paramilitary activity, shootings, bombings, and punishment attacks ultimately. And I think in 21-22, they're consistently at their lowest level that they've been in the last decade, ultimately. So from a trajectory point of view, I think there's been impressive progress.
You've mentioned some of there, Mr. Crawford, the traditional. We've been here a traditional way that they manifest their activities. As a committee, we've been hearing what is a very significant and identifiable growth in what you would describe as economic intimidation, lending at incredibly high interest rates, and if people then cannot make the payments, either finding payment in kind, effectively enforced prostitution. Or would you please look after this gun, drugs under the floorboards or in your loo cistern or whatever it may happen to be? Or can we borrow your 14-year-old boy to go and do something which we're not prepared to do ourselves? Now, those are not sort of bombs and baseball bats per se, but they are hugely, hugely impactful on a very vulnerable group of people in Northern Ireland, predominantly, though not exclusively, young single mothers who, in a cost of living crisis, have been finding things very difficult. How do you assess that with regards to the levels of activity which are taking place, and think about strategies to counteract them?
Well, we've been actually talking about this quite a lot with the various. I mean, I guess it's one of the things you would expect a Secretary of State and other ministers in the team to do, but when we go and visit different places, one of the aspects of the visits have been to meet some of the groups that offer support to people in such situations, to talk to those that are trying to police such situations. But I think the first thing I'd say is that I don't think paramilitary lending is a new thing. I think it might be something that's gaining traction and happening more, but I'm quite sure that it's been going on for a significant.
It has, but there's an identifiable increase, and it does seem to be manifesting itself. You'll be aware of the Spotlight programme BBC recently, but people who seem to be finding who is visiting a food bank, for example, who may have been signing on for universal credit, is awaiting their payment, and this is the tide you over bit of money that will just help you. Oh, by the way, you now owe us £300 rather than the £50 we lent you. So you're absolutely right. It's always been there, as it has been all over the place, but it does seem to be getting far worse. And is there not a risk that if those debts mount up, then it acts as a rather active recruiting sergeant for younger people deployed effectively by their parents as a way of paying off the debt and the loan.
Well, I mean, indeed, you asked me about the BBC Spotlight programme the night after it was
Yes,
aired
indeed.
in the House. And so I actually, if you recall, I hadn't seen it, I've seen it since. And yeah, I think those concerns truly do exist throughout the both policing and security ecosystem, and indeed through communities in Northern Ireland. And yes, we have to look at ways that we can try and get in right at the grassroots. But this is actually, and I know that you've heard lots of great evidence about how the work that's going on to try and strengthen communities throughout Northern Ireland so they can repel the advances from paramilitary groups, or those actually associated with paramilitary groups but coming to people's doorsteps, not necessarily wearing that paramilitary hat. Yes. To offer support and actually go through valid ways of getting support. And so that I mean, the thing is, it's not a new problem. It's certainly, I wouldn't even know if it was growing or not, because I think it hasn't been exposed to the level that that it currently is.
I think as a committee, I think we can say with near certainty that it is growing. That is certainly the evidence we've been hearing.
I mean, because it's not been measured necessarily in the past.
There's no baseline.
Yes, it's very difficult to
I get that.
But we are, there are now a lot of projects throughout all the communities that are affected by this, trying to make sure that, and maybe we'll come to talk about them, but trying to divert people from, invariably young men into other activities, and actually making sure proper activities, good activities that might mean a journey to employment, as well as the more traditional sporting and other pursuits. That there's a whole great third sector offering when it comes to helping people with their financial problems and other things, trying to intercept a person who's possibly falling into the grips of these people before they get there, by having a whole host of other services and structures available to them.
Do you think there's any merit for your department to have conversations with DWP with regards to the timetable of claiming, say, for example, universal credit? Because it's very often that black hole of financial self-sufficiency that is being exploited with an entirely different set of consequences to that which we would experience in, let's say, England or Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I do actually have conversations with with DWP ministers about, strange enough, about this, but a whole host of other issues where I think actually DWP offers great services.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes I think there is a bit of an element of not wanting to go to the government to claim to get the right level of benefits, and we will all have constituents who've struggled to get to do that, make that first step, and connect with the services and the things that are available. And I do think there is a bit of an issue in general in Northern Ireland, connecting people to the services that do already exist and making sure they know that they are there. But I know very well that my DWP colleagues are very aware that this is very important in Northern Ireland, like it is important elsewhere, but very important in Northern Ireland, to try and make sure the gap that you describe for universal credit, but equally there are other issues, first payment, sorting out bank accounts, a whole host of other things that they can step up to and help with.
My final question before I turn to Robin Walker. Let me just ask you, yesterday the government unveiled a set of proposals with regards to dealing with small boats, illegal immigration or migration. What conversations, if any, have you had or do you intend to have with the Home Office of a potential abuse of the common travel area, of people saying landing in the Republic, travelling to the north and then moving to GB? Aware of the Home Office proposals with regards to travel documentation and the like, but it's a window which is exploitable, isn't it? So
we've had a lot of conversations with the Home Office about this. both explaining to them the issue and...
Yes. Home Office very rarely seems to understand how the manoeuvrability on the island of Ireland works in practice.
Yeah, I mean...
is our experience as a committee.
I think there's much more awareness about the common travel area now in the Home Office than there's ever been before.
Well, that's encouraging. Robin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your comments, particularly about John Cornwell, Secretary of State. I think just wanted to come back to the Chairman's earlier point about the exploitation and targeting of children. I think we've all heard the stories about the people in smart cars waiting outside the school gates. Some of the stories that the Chair just mentioned in terms of people being given guns or drugs to hide in their houses and children being deliberately targeted. I absolutely accept your point about the different context in Northern Ireland to paramilitarism versus organised crime elsewhere, but sitting on two select committees as I do, we recently had a session at the Education Select Committee on county lines and the prevalence of that, and exactly the same behaviours that we are talking about here and that we have heard about repeatedly at this committee when it comes to paramilitary groups targeting children and getting them involved in their criminal activity and using those children as leverage on the parents and the family. I just wonder if you feel as Secretary of State that there is enough coordination between the work going on across England on county lines and what is going on in Northern Ireland, because of course I accept there's a different context to it, but actually the crimes are very much the same, the approaches are very much the same, and one of the things that both inquiries have perhaps drawn to my attention and to the attention of members is the fact that very few people ever seem to get prosecuted for coercive control or child abuse in these cases, even though that is effectively what is going on. And I just wonder if that's something that we should be looking at, is actually what is the guidance for prosecutions that take place, and whether in Northern Ireland the situation, because we have this dual layer of the PSNI looking at the sort of domestic crimes and the UK government being responsible for terrorism per se, whether that might get in the way sometimes of actually realising the seriousness of the crimes that are taking place against children.
Yeah, and it's a genuinely good question, because, and one I've asked in a whole different. How does Northern Ireland and policing in Northern Ireland learn the lessons of, or even actually help teach lessons to the various domestic forces in England, Scotland, and Wales? And actually, there is a very strong flow of information between across the system. It's been demonstrated to me when I've asked this question previously. Asked it actually yesterday in a meeting with one of the deputy, one of the high-ranking police officer, and it was very well demonstrated to me actually that lessons have been and there is now quite a healthy cross-fertilisation of expertise where people have been moving to Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland officers, PSNI officers, moving into other forces elsewhere, and there's the National College of Policing that does a huge amount of work in this space. There's the National Crime Agency that fits into this as well. And the one thing, because going back to something you said kind of in the middle of your question, which is really important to me and I needed to understand when I became Secretary of State, is that where I've described it, and I guess on an organogram that's what it looks like, you have national security and then you have domestic policing and what goes on in communities, that actually there needs to be a natural flow of information through the system and no one getting in each other's way, and in fact everybody helping each other with that system. Now, it's definitely not perfect, but I've been pleased to see the amount of information and cooperation that flows throughout the system. I'm not an expert on policing, so so I would not know how that compares to other places, although I was in a previous job the responsible minister for the British Transport Police, who have a very strong counter-terrorism arm. Yeah. And I think we've just seen in the Manchester Inquiry that everybody can learn lessons from every force can learn lessons in different ways. But for the limited comparators that I truly have, I think actually it's in a good and healthy state. but can obviously continually be improved and should be. How that looks, how that feels on the ground, I mean, are we learning? So yes, there are people who have got expertise in county lines that are talking to the PSNI, and there are people with experience of county lines within PSNI, and so I don't think there's a kind of gap in knowledge, but it's a very different understanding, especially when I'm sure we'll get on to maybe how things work across the border in cross-border cooperation. Yeah. But this is one area where I'd say it's particularly strong.
That's reassuring. If I may just one other, we talked about the statistics and absolutely recognise there's an encouraging trend in at least the visible statistics of punishment, beatings, etc. The question that I asked the police on a number of occasions and wasn't able really to get any answers to, and I accept what the Secretary of State says about what's happened in Belfast and the improvement in the situation there in general, but could we have any examples of areas that were under paramilitary control at the time of the Good Friday Agreement but were no longer under paramilitary control or influence, and sadly I wasn't really able to be given any reassurance on that. Do you think some kind of a geographical approach is actually useful in this respect, in terms of looking at areas which were where paramilitary control can be removed or can be demonstrated to have dissipated?
So I have a very similar view to you in this, Mr. Walker, because I think it's, and it might be slightly crude to say, but it's fair to say there are decent geographic areas where there is obvious paramilitary activity and has been for a very long time. I'm afraid I don't go. My corporate historic knowledge doesn't go back all the way the 25 years to when the BGFA was signed. However, when we come, and I know we're going to talk about it, but when we come to hopefully getting to the point where we can transition these groups away from being paramilitaries, there is an argument, a very strong argument, that they are not one big structural unit, that they're actually, and I think you can do that by geographical area, I'm sure.
Can I just pick you up on something that Secretary of State? You've just said transitioning. There's been 25 years to transition. And those that haven't, would seem to me, are probably the hardest nuts to crack. When do we draw the line? When do you draw the line? When does the PCSNI draw the line on transitioning and just do crackdown and annihilation? Because, maybe not the most elegant phrase to use, they've been given enough rope, and those that haven't transitioned have now hung themselves.
So I mean, I'd love to think that we are near that point, but I actually know that I'm quite sure that we are not. There are some of these paramilitary style groups who are still well organised and still not willing to go down a path to something. There are others that are, and some within the same group moniker in different places or at different stages. I'm pretty sure I'm not a policing expert again, and again with Northern Ireland has its own specific and special and concerning history in this space, but I'm pretty sure a crackdown and annihilation is not where police tactics would go, and I'm pretty sure the reaction would be not the one that we would wish to see. However, I get your point entirely that Northern Ireland is moving. I think it's actually moving forward quicker now towards a much stronger, much more stable, much more prosperous environment, where actually the traction of these individuals and groups is already in areas where there are better jobs. I think you can probably point to the fact that they are weaker, right? And so there is a proper route, both in policing terms, in how you set up community structures and how they work, making sure, and we do have a responsibility as a government to try and make Northern Ireland as prosperous as we could possibly make it. All of those things contribute to this, but the one thing, and looking at the Northern Irish politicians in the room, I have learnt very quickly as Secretary of State is there is no point having a timetable for anything in Northern Ireland, because you set up deadlines and then everybody's focused on the wrong thing.
Yes. Yes, no, I take that. Let me just, Mr. Walker was asking about sort of sentencing and all that. So, given the fact that we want to try and turn the dial to make their activities less socially acceptable, hiding behind these flags of convenience, would you agree with me that it would be right for a so-called paramilitary who inserts anally against a child's will a cache of drugs to be transported across a town or a city, should, as well as being charged with drug dealing, should also be charged with rape?
My gut reaction is absolutely 100%, and probably a lot of other things as well.
Mm-hmm. Because we don't do it like that, do we?
We don't seem to.
And that's the problem. I think if the prosecution authorities looked at it in the round, instead of just that act, nobody wants to say, I'm working for a child rapist or a child sexual assaulter, a child abuser, because that is what it is. Mr. Wilson, you're nodding.
Yeah, no, but it does come back to the point that you made earlier, and Mr. Walker did about terminology and the language that you use. You used the phrase child abuse. You know, this is not, in many cases, paramilitary style beatings or punishment beatings. It is, the harm is child abuse, and we should call it out for
we should stop calling them punishment abuse.
Exactly.
Punishment beatings.
We should
because
call it out for what it is.
These people are not arbiters of who should be punished and who shouldn't be.
And as I think you'll have probably heard from the Department of Justice and the TPP programme, a lot of what they're trying to do is to change the language that is used in some of those areas.
Mary.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. Returning slightly to the issue that the Chair raised about young women and specifically young women in some of these communities that depended on the money lenders and the criminal gangs. I think from the evidence that we heard, the fundamental and overwhelming issue is poverty, and for the reasons that they're using these money lenders. And what surprised me was the fact that without a functioning executive at the minute, there is no formal childcare provision in Northern Ireland, which was a huge barrier to these young women getting into work or even being allowed to train for work, to even think about a career. No formal childcare because of no functioning executive, and it was a huge barrier to work, and therefore massive poverty in these estates. And these young women weren't, I wouldn't say that they were reluctant to claim benefits. It's more that they're desperate. And if they don't have that income, then they turn into money lenders, prostitution, people trafficking, all of those activities that these criminal gangs are carrying out. And this will continue without childcare provision. It's something as simple as that. So I don't know whether you've spoke to the DWP about how can the government step in whilst there is no functioning executive to provide something as simple as formal childcare provision for these women, because the evidence we heard, it was hundreds and hundreds of them.
And forgive me for making the obvious point, but there not being an executive has caused a whole host of issues that are not helpful in this space, not helpful in the tackling poverty space, not helpful in the education space, not helpful in the health space, not helpful across a whole host of areas. but there is, behind all this, of course, the DWP still does provide the level of benefits that people would expect to be provided, and all the statutory duties that are required are being fulfilled to the best of the ability of the civil service in Stormont, so Northern Ireland Civil Service as well. And so there's your point is well made. That I had a fascinating meeting yesterday with a lady who is engaged with lots of, in fact, I've had a number of meetings with the various women's centres in Northern Ireland about what services they can offer, what they're trying to do in their communities across Northern Ireland. And whilst you've identified the issue as it is now, I actually see, and I think, the vast majority of the people that we're talking about are people who'd love to be called, the big man in their area. I think in what I'm looking and what I'm seeing in some of these spaces now is really strong women coming to the fore to actually almost counteract them. And so, yes, you're right, we need to sort out all the issues of poverty, and actually that's why, and prosperity hopefully does some of that, and yes, we need the executive back, so the issues that you found that were being blamed on there being no executive can be solved. But I think there is something, I think it's already going on, and I've met some of these individuals where helping to empower the right sort of people to in their local communities, and lots of them are women who've just had enough of what's been going on in the past, is a way, of, an extra way of getting right to the heart of the communities that we need to help. I'm afraid it is the word transition, but transition away from paramilitarism.
Robert Cooper.
Morning, Secretary of State. We've already discussed the importance of terminology, and indeed you've mentioned the danger of giving these groups military attributes that they don't deserve. So I could ask, how does the Northern Ireland Office define paramilitarism, and how does this definition differentiate from the definition of terrorism? And indeed, does the use of the word paramilitarism risk legitimising criminals' influence on the communities that they seek to coerce or control?
Yeah, so there's no, the one thing that, I've learned so many things in 6 months you'd not, not believe, but there isn't a simple definition of paramilitarism in the Northern Ireland context at all. The Fresh Start panel noted back in in the 2016 report on the disbandment of paramilitary groups that no two groups or individuals within these groups were the same, and they pointed to all the significant differences in the nature and evolution of the various groups themselves, and a single definition just doesn't capture the complexity of all these groups in the slightest. And we've got to be, again, these groups do resemble, and I've said this before, they do resemble organised crime gangs in some ways, but in other ways, there's this overlay of historical context that means they are organised in the way that they have. They organise differently. They use militaristic language and paraphernalia themselves, and actually quite different to organised crime in Great Britain. Sometimes do have political objectives as well.
It's up to them how they refer to themselves, but in some way are we legitimising them and sort of referring to what they would see as their glorious past by just not calling them organised criminal gangs or armed groups?
Yeah, as I think Dominic Wilson said, we are changing the way that we use language about them, but they are commonly known as paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland, and whilst I'm very keen to make sure that these groups are transitioned away and do other things in their communities, I think it's going to be a hard ask to change to get the people of Northern Ireland to call them anything else. So like you, I feel that we should not be in that space of trying to allow them to use this terminology, but we are where we are in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Can we just turn to pounds, shillings and pence? Clearly, budgetary pressures on the PSNI are likely to have an impact on policing and therefore law enforcement's ability to tackle paramilitarism. And the absence of the executive is, of course, having significant short-term funding problems for a whole variety of people and organisations who are focused on trying to keep young people on the straight and narrow or get them back onto the straight and narrow, deal with the issues that Mr. Walker and Mary Kelly Foy has been talking about, etc. These are serious problems. They are likely to interrupt the development of relationships of trust in many areas of communities where trust is at a premium. And therefore any disruption to that actually sets it back, progress back at a greater level than it would in, I'm tempted to say, any other part of the United Kingdom. Against that backdrop, Secretary of State, what are you considering doing? What are you able to do? I know that you will say, we've got to get the executive back up and running, and I would say amen to that. But in practical short-term budgetary support, what can be done?
So, and forgive me for saying what you expect me to say, but we've got to get the executive up and running. I mean, but there is, and whilst it is something that is the easiest thing to say, let me just demonstrate why that is important. Without an executive, in fact, last year there was no budget set. So, and that meant that actually, whether it be community groups who are reliant on a part of funding, their funding coming from the Northern Executive, or whether it be the police, because policing is devolved, having a budget that's going, well, almost like ad hoc, because you can't even say from year to year, because not having a budget set means it's all up in the air, causes great problems and issues for those. I've met dozens and dozens of community groups and representatives of the sectors involved who would just love to know what they were going to get in this financial year, love to know what they're going to get in the next financial year, so they could plan and continue to do their work. And that is as a direct result of not having an executive up and running. As you know, yes, we on October the 28th, the Northern Ireland office, Secretary of State, took over some of those responsibilities, and we did set a budget, and but it was a budget set in circumstances that when we did not have all the information available that was required. So there's a whole. This is not an ideal solution. But to answer your question in the way that you want me to answer it about what am I doing, what can we do? Well, firstly, I actually do have conversations with the PSNI about this, and trying to understand what their asks are and what they need. Now, police, just to completely clarify things that you all know, but if people watching might not, that policing and justice is a devolved matter, and so it is direct responsibility of the executive. But we have in those conversations, I'm trying to make sure that there's elements of the budget that the British government have kind of have put in place. Actually, arrangements have been in place since 2010 to provide ring-fenced additional security funding for counter-terrorism activity in Northern Ireland. The UK contribution for the financial year 22-23 is £32.1 million. This is the same as provided for 21-22 and has been provided each year since 2015. Now, that provision is agreed on the presumption that the Department of Justice in Northern Ireland match fund the money coming from the UK government. And so there are elements of funding that go to PSNI that are directly coming from UK government. But throughout those conversations, I've seen in GB policing, and certainly I saw in the policing of the British Transport Police, that policing can't stand still. Yeah. And there's definitely reforms and things that can happen, but that's not my responsibility. But I'm making sure I'm listening to the PSNI.
Let me just ask the question of Mr. and Mrs. Smith on the Ballymena omnibus, because you mentioned in answer to an earlier question that people don't really get involved with the process about what's devolved and what might be the responsibility of a local council or Westminster or whatever. But nobody gives a toss about that. They just want to see good services and a peaceful society and a growing economy and all the rest of it. So against that backdrop, joint authority, perfectly correctly, has been ruled out. Direct rule, perfectly properly and legitimately, has been ruled out by you to me at the dispatch box. I endorse that entirely. You have said, both in front of this committee and on the floor of the House, that any reform to the rules governing the formation of the executive would need to be, you would be responding to, and I sort of slightly paraphrase your statement, but from a grassroots up from Northern Ireland, urging you to do something with some suggestions maybe as to what it might be. That's all well and good, but it doesn't address what is the fundamental budgeting issue, and those who are most vulnerable in Northern Irish society, irrespective of which, if any, tradition they put their cross or their loyalties, are suffering. So how does the NIO, how does HMG square that incredibly difficult circle? Because we can't just stand by idly and say, we know it's all frightfully difficult, and we know we'd like to do something, but that would be direct rule, we're not doing that. We need to get the executive back up and running. Oh, there's no executive, therefore nothing can be done. So people who are involved in vital work with youngsters, combating paramilitary activity, are left without any budgetary certainty. They can't recruit, they can't retain staff, they can't renew leases on properties, so on and so forth. And we end up probably with a whole raft of people who we need to have faith in politics, giving up on politics and politicians and the political process, just saying, to hell with it, we're just going to go back to a very sort of feudal, tribal way of doing things because that's the only way we can get things done.
Yeah, and I completely understand the point you're making, Mr. Chairman, but actually it is not as simple as that, and let me demonstrate that, because, and I know the committee knows this, but the basis of where policing sits is not because there was just a dividing up of a piece of cake. The Assembly back, it wasn't 2 decades ago, the Assembly was suspended from October 2002 till May 2007, following the withdrawal from unionist parties after Sinn Féin's offices in Stormont was searched by the PSNI. In a bid to reconvene the Assembly back then, multi-party talks were convened by the UK government that led to the St Andrews Agreement in 2006. As a part of that agreement, Sinn Féin was for the first time committed to support the PSNI. Move forward a few years and you get the restoration order that's signed in March 2007, leading to the return of the executive in May with Ian Paisley as First Minister and Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister. In 2010, the Hillsborough Castle Agreement was reached, enabling the devolution of policing and justice to the Northern Ireland Executive to try and put it into the right space for policing to be trusted in the way that we would all like it to be. So actually, the issue that is, I completely get that people in Northern Ireland, well, actually, people in Northern Ireland, I think, are very politically aware and know their history better than I certainly do. But there are reasons as to why things lie where they are, and actually short-term leaping in to do something could actually create much more difficult problems or unpick things that have been done in the past and work for just a short-term fix. And so I am very aware of the responsibilities in their life, which is why I try, as I say, I talk to the PSNI, I make sure I constantly harrying Treasury ministers and the like. However, I know that this is a very delicately stitched arrangement behind policing that has evolved over the years to ensure that all the communities in Northern Ireland can have confidence in their policing. And actually, I think it is working. And so I'm very wary of trying to do anything in the kind of short-term fix area that undermines any of that.
Okay, would you describe as a short-term fix sorting out the funding for the tackling paramilitarism programme for 24-25?
No, I mean, that's something that UK government's been involved in this space for ages. So it's not, that is, and again, that's a fund that we, I think, has match funding from elsewhere too. So, yeah, that's a longer term fix.
Hannah.
Thank you very much, Chair and the Secretary of State. I wanted to ask about coordination and having an effective whole system approach, and actually in that context it's absolutely right that the Chair has focused on the issue of budget, because we are in a scenario where there have been active murder attempts, lots of fighting talk from loyalism, as well as just the continued poison of organised crime. So in that context, that the PSNI aren't able to fire on all cylinders, it is appropriate that the government show solidarity with them, and in particular because dissident Republicans, to the extent that they have any particular aim and aren't just obsessed with violence, what they are trying to do is ensure that policing isn't normalised and the community policing doesn't happen, and that young people, particularly when they come in contact with the police, are engaging and seeing them in a militarised TSG way, and by not ensuring that the PSNI have adequate funding to do community policing, we're almost reinforcing that. It's also the case, as far as I can tell, that the NCA spend 1% of their budget here, despite us having 3% of the UK population, and perhaps that is why there have been almost no unexplained wealth orders. And we don't get, I know under St Andrews there were to be reviews of national security work, but they aren't published. So in your view, are the structures and systems in place to tackle this appropriately? If you look at, for example, some of the dismantling work that has been done of dissident Republicans, should that be extended into loyalism, and have those more collaborative approaches that the Chair touched on with the likes of community resilience programmes that you mentioned, have they suffered in the absence of an executive?
But to answer the last question first, I mean, I think lots of the community resilience programs that I've mentioned, I don't think they've suffered immediately from the removal of an executive. However, they are very, very concerned about what their budget is going to look like for the next financial year, and I've heard of examples of where contracts haven't been given to continued for people who are working in these spaces and stuff. So I can give you anecdotal evidence on that, but I can't give you a across the board answer. When it comes to policing, I actually do think the police currently are funded to a level that allows them to do all the things that we would expect them to do in this committee. And in fact, I said to the Chief Constable last week when I was visiting Omar that I was not just impressed by the people I met there, but when I've been around and about community policing, which is actually not novel, but relatively new to Northern Ireland is obviously paying great dividends, and I've met with some amazing police officers who are doing great work in their own communities, almost like as Robert Peel would have liked it. You know, local people policing their local communities.
Did the Chief Constable indicate that he thought that he was adequately funded to continue to provide?
Oh no,
that?
as you know, he would like he wants to he has plans for more officers and whatever, and I believe he sent all the political parties in Northern Ireland some correspondence about what that looks like and what he'd like. However, I just want to make the point that policing in Northern Ireland at this point in time, I think it is with the resources they have, I think they are doing an exceptionally good job, and the level of community policing, which I think is probably the highest it's been for quite some, well, possibly ever, in Northern Ireland, I believe is paying dividends, which, just to directly answer your question, but then in budgetary terms, what else happens? Now, Mr. Dominic Wilson beside me is a member of the Tackling Paramilitary Programme sponsor group, and both checks on where money is being spent, on how money is being spent, and the policies behind it. Dominic, I don't know if you could give the committee a flavour of that.
So I think in answer to your question on collaboration, I mean it's difficult, isn't it? It's a complex business. It's a hard business. So that, let's get that straight up. At an operational level, I think PSNI and the Security Service work very closely. There are other structures that you will have heard around some of the organised crime space with the National Crime Agency and HMRC and PSNI, the Paramilitary Crime Task Force and all that. So there's that. So operational collaboration, and then there is also reach back into NCA capabilities in the UK. So how that translates to your 1%, I think we could dig into how much is permanently allocated in Northern Ireland and how much is available as a sort of as a reach back as well. Then moving into integration and collaboration in the interface between operational delivery and the sort of the policy world. We have regular conversations, as the Secretary of State said, at his level with PSNI and with the Security Service. James, there isn't a week that goes by without James having a conversation with the likes of Mark McEwen and equivalents. So that conversation happens as well. As the Secretary of State said, on the broader community outside of law enforcement through the TPP programme, James sits on the 3 benefits realisation groups that meet quarterly. I sit on the sponsor group. So it is absolutely tied together. I think if there is one area, and it slightly returns us to some of the earlier conversation, I think the next step, and you've probably heard this from TPP as well, is how the tackling the paramilitary problem becomes a whole of government approach in Northern Ireland, but also to a certain extent here as well. And you highlighted some examples of conversations with DWP, for example, but certainly taking paramilitarism across all the resources that and programmes that are spent in Northern Ireland, I think is quite important, and that sort of preventative approach is what the TPP are trying to do.
Well, that's an encouraging assessment in terms of the coordination, but I'll just reiterate with all of those sharp political contexts that maybe weren't in place when budgets were being established, and the fact that we don't have power to mitigate this in the absence of an executive. As you said, they are doing a good job on community policing, and thank God for them. And I think all of us would struggle to get up and do the job that they do with the threat that they are now facing. So the context of having, being underfunded to the tune of, I think, £200 million, that is concerning. I just wanted to briefly ask your view on the space and the validation everyday discourse is giving to paramilitaries. How concerned are you that for example, constant flying of paramilitary emblems, particularly in loyalism, and constant utilisation and foregrounding of past exploits in republicanism is perpetuating this stuff and keeping society's tolerance of paramilitarism too high. I know the PREVENT programme is not without controversy, but it seems I can't imagine for a minute that the overall noise and space provided to paramilitarism would be tolerated for a minute in this country.
Yeah, but it's, again, I've come to learn that everything in Northern Ireland is about understanding and balance. And if you were to take away some of those communities' opportunities to, I understand the point about symbols as well, completely. But that's why, I've met with the commission that deals with flags and parades, and they do amazing work behind the scenes on trying to make sure that spaces where issues might have happened in the past, or where things fall on certain dates that are of importance, there are proper conversations, and they're not done at kind of government to individual level government bearing down, but done by people within the community, so there's an understanding of the pressures and the needs and what issues might flow from doing something. And there's not been many of these issues since COVID, and I hope that continues to be the case. But I think there is much better understanding. I don't know, James, have you got anything to offer in this space?
No, well, just to say, on your specific points on flags and emblems and so on, the Commission for Flags, Identity and Culture and Tradition did make recommendations.
Did a long time ago, and they haven't gone anywhere.
Exactly, and I think for us that's one of the reasons why we think the absence of the executive is having an impact in this area. But there are those recommendations that are out there that they need to be acted on at this stage.
Up to the current moment, can I ask, do you think we're giving too much space in broadcast for this material? Senior PSNI officers confirmed to us earlier in this inquiry that as regards for example, the protocol rallies and loyalism, senior figures that they associate with paramilitaries were prominent in those, and we now regularly have loyalist community representatives in the media amping up that threat. Clearly throughout the Brexit years we know that MI5, PSNI and others gave an assessment of the exploitation that they thought dissident Republicans might try to pursue in the event of a different Brexit outcome, but they weren't given space to in long form do good cop, bad cop in the media. Is that something we need to reconsider? Should broadcasters maybe stick with analysis from that, or security assessment? Are we creating a problem when we constantly platform people to give us their personal views on the capacity or intent of paramilitary organisations?
So tempted I am to give a personal opinion here. The one thing I do know as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is that issues around broadcast and who goes on for interview and free speech are very, very thorny issues that I would not want to be the Secretary of State who leans in to suggest who the BBC give a platform to.
I'll ask you in another way. Do you think political actors are leaving too much space for aggressive voices in political discourse, and should political representatives attempt to close that space?
So I think there is an opportunity that is presenting itself now for political representatives to be much more active in this area, and I think that's what their communities would like them to do as well.
Thank you.
Oh, you wanted to come in?
Yeah,
Thank you for changing the question.
Thank you, Secretary of State and panel members. Just around that glorification, and Claire has obviously spoken of her thoughts on it, but at the end of the day, we in Northern Ireland have a political party who will, to all intents and purposes, if the Assembly is restored, will be First Minister. And there's the continual glorification of terrorism by those individuals, and the saying that there was no alternative. You only have to think last week when Mary Lou MacDonald and Michelle O'Neill carried the coffin of an on the run, someone who was wanted in Northern Ireland for the attempted murder of an army warrant officer, who had convictions down south as well. Can the Secretary of State, outline if he has any intention of outlawing glorification of terrorism? Because the terrorism in 1983 is no different, or 1984, 85 is no different to terrorism today. And I would like to know what the government actually intend to do on this, because it is encouraging young people to take up arms, get involved in criminality. You only have to look at the age of the people who are singing ooh ah up the rah. So what more can we do? And what more will the government do?
So there's never been any justification for paramilitary activity in Northern Ireland at all, and there is none today. And I do understand that commemoration is an unbelievably complex issue, and I've had representations personally from both communities on issues to do with this. But forgive me, Mr. Lockhart, but it's something that the executive leads on. And we should not allow a culture to emerge which glorifies violence of the past. Completely agree with you. Risks individuals vulnerable to present narratives kind of getting involved in things they don't want to around the justification of violence. Absolutely right. But again, this is something that sits in this devolved space. And so maybe the government should get involved, but the government that should get involved is the executive.
Well, due respect,
Yes.
the individuals that are glorifying the terrorism are part of that executive, and I'm not certain they'll take action against themselves. There is an opportunity, and there was an opportunity within legislation recently around the glorification element, and there still is an opportunity, and I believe it would be very fitting for this UK government, who are sovereign in all of these matters, to take action and to actually introduce legislation. I know that we as a party, and my colleague sitting to my right will back me up on this, we sought to bring forward an amendment that would outlaw glorification of terrorism, and it was written off by the government, and it wasn't accepted. So it's the Home Office, in my mind, needs to deal with terrorism and the glorification of it.
And the Home Office does so in Great Britain, but as I say, this is actually, and there's a good reason for why this particular issue has been devolved. And I hear exactly what you say about the people that you mentioned in various things, but I do recall, and this is more of a historic interest, I guess, that 25 years ago, there were people equally who had maybe been involved in things that we would not have tolerated, who then changed into being some of the people who brought peace and stability to Northern Ireland in no uncertain terms. And I think it's important, actually, to note the united condemnation from all the political parties in response to the shooting of DCI Caldwell. And the clear message of opposition that has been sent by all the political leaders in Northern Ireland back to those who seek to drag us back to the dim, dark, horrible days of the past. So yeah, I understand the point that you make, but I think the government could do more, but the government that could do more is the executive.
I just want to bring in Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor, and law officer. On that point, Robert.
Good to see you, Secretary of State, and of course it was a pleasure to be a fellow territorial officer with you and to take the responsibility of warrantry for a time relating to your duties as Northern Ireland Secretary. On the point about glorification and encouragement of terrorism, the 06 Terrorism Act, which has a UK-wide application, makes that a criminal offence. And I think it would be interesting to know or the occasions whereby that has been used, perhaps, in Northern Ireland. I'm not expecting necessarily Mr Crawford to have all the figures to hand, but I do think it would be interesting to note that whether those provisions, I think in Section 1 of that Act, have indeed been used. I remember they were extremely controversial at the time because of the definitional concerns about what it meant, and it was an extension of the law away from either acts of terrorism or inciting or aiding or abetting acts of terrorism. As somebody, a lot of people say there ought to be a law against it. Well, there is. Are we using it?
I honestly don't know the answer to your question. I'll write back if I may.
Of course. Thank you, Secretary.
Carla, had you finished?
I just...
Because I wanted...
Yeah, I just go back to, we have people today who are condemning the murder of John Caldwell, which is absolutely right and correct.
Attempted murder.
Yet they don't... the attempted murder, apologies, but they don't condemn, and they think there was no alternative to the shooting of a gentleman in Fermanagh beside his son in a tractor.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Sorry, it's always a great to have you here and to speak to you as well, and it's a pleasure. I'm always very conscious of our past, of course. Never forget the past, but always look to the future. That's the way we should. I'm mindful as well that I want to give 3 examples and then refer to one today if I can. I'm always concerned that when it comes to better working relationships with the Army and the police in Northern Ireland, MI5 as well, because it comes across that, and the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland very often is found wanting in relation to that. The one example I'll give right now, I'm Chief Inspector Harry Breen, Superintendent Bob Buchanan, murdered on the 20th of March. The anniversary will be next week, 1989 at Jonesborough. The IRA had a bomb at the side of the road, and they murdered the 2 of them as they crossed the border. At that time, and my party leader, Jeffrey Donaldson, has referred to this as well in discussions, mentioned that there was allegations and some evidential base to prove it of Garda Síochána collusion in what took place. That's an example of some of my concerns, Mr. Chairman, to the Secretary of State in relation to that. The Omagh bomb, the member for North Down and myself were in the chamber that day whenever the statement was made, and I think I made the comment and others did as well. The bomb was constructed in the Republic of Ireland. It was moved from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland to Omagh, where it was then detonated, and 29 people lost their lives, including 2 unborn. Ever mindful, that's another example of where the Republic of Ireland, when it comes to working better together in security, have fallen down. A third example of that, Mr. Chairman, is on the 10th of December 1971. My cousin Kenneth Smith was murdered by the IRA. 3 IRA men murdered him. His colleague was a guy called Daniel McCormick, a father of 5. He just happened to be a Roman Catholic. He also was a former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And the IRA, when they murdered them, crossed the border and escaped, and were never made accountable for that. So we look at these examples, Mr. Chairman. We look at a very Republic of Ireland government and the security forces down there, and a government that seems to turn a blind eye to whenever IRA terrorists cross the border to escape their murderous campaign against people in Northern Ireland. Those are just 3 examples. I could give many, many more. You, Mr. Chairman, would bring me into line because you would say you're going on too long. But these are people who I feel incredibly I feel annoyed about, I feel strongly about. Never seen justice for my cousin or Daniel McCormick, Kenneth Smith, Daniel McCormick. Never seen justice for those who lost their loved ones in Omagh. Never seen justice for Chief Inspector Breen or Superintendent Bob Buchanan. So really, Secretary of State, what can I ask you very respectfully? What discussions you have had with the Republic of Ireland when it comes to making them accountable and for collusion that the Garda Síochána have been involved in to thwart and to promote the IRA campaign against people who are custodians of law and order and are tasked with that job?
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, because I mean, Mr. Shannon is quite rightly upset about those, and actually, Jim, you've also raised other cases with me in the past, and I'm fully aware of how the emotion you feel when you're talking about this. So, and I completely respect the manner in which you've been able to raise this today. And so what I'll try to do is answer both how we look at things and how they worked in the past, but also how it's working in the present. Because
I think just to interrupt for one second, the reason why I mentioned those three examples in the past is because it is rumoured and alleged that the people who carried out the murders, the attempted murder of Inspector Caldwell, also run across the border. So if it happened in 10th of December 1971 and it's happening today, then what has improved with the Republic of Ireland? What has improved with their security forces? What has improved with their police? Can I say it looks like nothing has improved?
So Jim, in essence, I think your question is, what's the state of current discussions with the Republic and the Gardaí, and what, if any, discussion is given to unanswered questions over that period of the Troubles, in essence?
That would be it, yeah. Thank you.
I can say that in some of the cases, certainly of the past, that we, in my time as Secretary of State, I'd like to think we have a very good relation. I have a very good relationship with my Irish interlocutors, and we both I and the two Irish foreign ministers that I've dealt with have raised different cases over time. I had a conversation about what I was doing with the public inquiry for Omar with my Irish counterpart, because I recognise that there is an Irish element to this as well as, and so I understand the point that Mr. Shannon is making. I'd like to think, actually, though, that partnerships between the UK government, the devolved administration in Northern Ireland, the security services, the police on cross-border matters are all actually getting stronger and stronger by the day. And certainly the relationships between the PSNI and the Garda Síochána are strong. At an operational level, there is strong cross-organisational coordination in place to try and ensure a strong, robust law enforcement response tackling those crimes around terrorism, paramilitarism, and organised crime, because almost going back to the county lines discussion we were talking about earlier, the lines of organised crime don't just stop when you get to the border. So there is quite a proactive approach to ensuring effective cross-border law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And actually, what we've seen following the attack of DCI Caldwell, I would like to think demonstrates a proper understanding of how we can help each other in this. Actually, immediately, the day after DCI Caldwell was shot, I had Simon Harris, the Irish Minister for Justice, on the phone, not just offering an expression of support and solidarity, but whatever assistance the Irish state could give in the aftermath of the attack. The committee may have noted that set out by, I think it was Drew Harris, you had as a commissioner of the Garda, that beyond the regular routine contact that his officers have with the PSNI, they acted immediately in the aftermath of that attack to support PSNI with patrols in border areas, investigations and inquiries, so PSNI officers could go do what we would have expected them to do around dealing with the immediate aftermath of the attempted murder of DCI Caldwell. There's a whole host of different agreements and arrangements. There are officers posted seconded in a way into each other's forces. There is a lot of cross-fertilization, and so I'm actually quite positive about the current and future arrangements and cooperation on policing and security and dealing with paramilitarism. But I also know that we have to deal with the issues of the past, and there is a strong difference of opinion as to how to do that. The government has its own ideas, which we've brought forward in the Legacy Bill.
Thank you. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. Just want to ask you a couple of questions around what constitutes a national security threat. We're looking at it from two particular angles. I mean, first of all, it's my understanding that essentially dissident Republican activity is treated as a national security threat alongside a challenge for local policing in Northern Ireland, whereas loyalism is treated essentially as a criminal matter for the Northern Ireland authorities solely. So first of all, in light of, shall we say, some comments and threats that have emanated from loyalism in recent months, and not least the targeting of the Irish Foreign Minister, is there now a case for saying that some elements of loyalism are effectively a national security threat and a threat to democracy and the state? The second angle looking at this is around the evidential opportunities. I think it's worth praising both the Police Service in Northern Ireland and also the Security Service for recent successes in cracking down on dissident Republicans, particularly Operation Arbacia, which was very successful. By contrast, there is frustration in the community at, shall we say, the impunity with some loyalists and the inability to get arrests to stand and convictions. Is part of the issue there the wider use of intelligence gathering and other evidence gathering techniques on the one side versus, shall we say, an over-reliance upon human witnesses being willing to come forward and give evidence in court with all the intended risks that involves in a place like Northern Ireland?
Yeah. So obviously, whilst I'm kind of the person responsible for national security in Northern Ireland, I do not make the assessments as to what is viewed to be an element of national, whether it's a national security or so. You've got definitions and what qualifies as a national security incident or whatever are not mine for defining. I don't know if either of you can help me out on.
So there isn't a set definition, and as you know, the UK government produces sort of periodically a national security strategy, and every time it does, it differs in scope to some degree. For the purposes of this conversation, though, the current view of national security is that it does cover a range of activities, from obviously terrorism through to serious organised crime as well. So there is nothing in the sort of definition space, I think, that causes a problem. Individual organisations have both sort of statutory and operational responsibilities, and so the trick is how they match their resources and work together, I think, probably to get to your question.
And collectively, do you take my point around the different approaches to evidence gathering on the one hand between dissident Republicans and loyalism, and how that maybe leads to maybe differential impacts and successes in terms of securing convictions?
I mean, you mentioned the incident around in North Belfast around the former Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney on the 25th of March last year. That was properly investigated, and I believe charges were brought. So I think there is. I think the full weight of the investigative process behind the scenes, whatever, was thrown at all this, and I'm pretty sure that following security operations in Belfast and Ballymena last summer, 2 men were arrested under the Terrorism Act. 2 firearms were recovered, and both were subsequently released from police custody pending further investigations, which are continuing. So it's I think
Can I just remind the whole committee that that case is, of course, sub judice?
Yeah. If I maybe just maybe move on from that case, maybe just talk in more general terms. I mean, for example, there's never been, to my knowledge, in recent times, a conviction for someone instigating a paramilitary style attack, because you are essentially reliant upon a complainant coming forward and saying that person there threatened me and did this because of the obvious fear of retribution for their family, and or perhaps someone's going to be expelled from their house and moved out from the community. Is there more that can be done between the security service and the PSNI to break that vicious cycle, so we can actually not rely upon that human witness exposing themselves to all that risk?
I mean, so actually I think there is a lot that goes on in this space, and it's very difficult to comment on in public.
One final question, Secretary of State, just maybe building slightly on Claire's point. Could you clarify for us what is the official position of the Northern Ireland Office on the status of the Loyalist Communities Council? I mean, do you see it purely as a front for paramilitary organisations, terrorist organisations, or do you see it as a political actor? I'm conscious that there has been meetings, maybe not during your tenure, but between some of your predecessors and officials with them.
Yeah, I mean, so I've not met with the Loyalist Communities Council or anyone that I believe is a member of or purporting to represent that organisation, and we obviously don't. So I don't think there is. You asked for a definition of what it is. I don't know what I would formally define the Loyalist Community Council as.
That's an answer on a postcard.
Yeah, I'm sure we have got but in my knowledge, it's never been given a definition whilst I've been in the room.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think the concern would be in the community. I mean, this isn't solely an issue for the Northern Ireland Office. To many people, it is simply a front for 2 or 3 active paramilitary organisations. But some people do treat it as essentially a political actor with opinions that are seen as being as worthy as those of us who have elected mandates, and there is a concern, shall we say, that this is an erosion of the democratic process, that we bring these actors in from left field and treat them ineffectively as a de facto political party.
Yeah, no, I do understand that point, and as I say, I've not met with anyone that purports to represent them. On the definition point, I honestly don't know the answer, so I'll have to come back to you, and I apologise for that lapse.
All right, thank you, Ross. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Robert Buckland.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. We've already, I think, in your responses, dealt with aspects of the tackling paramilitarism programme, and I think you will be asked about governance in particular. Let's just track back to 2015 and Fresh Start, where clearly there was a really sensible attempt to bring together the issue of paramilitarism itself and also the wider socioeconomic causes and background to it, to bring it together, if you like, to look at it more as a public health matter, on the social model, rather than just always looking at it as a criminal justice matter. It's something been banging on about for years in various contexts here in England and Wales. I could ask you in general terms how effective you think it's been, but what I'm really interested in is what metrics are we using to measure effectiveness of this approach, and are we confident that the public health approach that was clearly presaged by the Fresh Start Agreement is actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, there are various. In fact, I'll turn to James in a second to give you an idea of the kind of metrics that exist. But it is part of the. I think it is working in many areas. It obviously needs the communities to want to respond in those areas, and I have seen examples of where it is working, and I've heard of examples where it has not. And I actually think you need what we have developed, or what has developed in Northern Ireland. It's not my responsibility, and it's not because of me that it's happened in the slightest. But there are people now thinking all the way through the line, right from the very trying to deal with this problem at the very grassroots level, to properly intercepting the proceeds of ill-gotten gains and crime at the highest level, using all the levers that we have through our criminal justice system. And I believe I believe you've been given, in fact I gave them to you in the letter, some good statistics that demonstrate how all this can work at the top level. But I don't know if, James, you've got...
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with the Tackling Paramilitarism programme, metrics, it's very hard to measure ultimately, and I mean I've got a lot of respect for the work that has been done, and I think actually the methodology that they're using, the benefits realisation, is hugely important here, because rather than just focusing on the outputs from the 80 or so projects that they've got, which are important and can be measured as far as engagement and so on, they're actually looking at the overarching outcomes and the societal change that we want to see. And that is hard to measure, and that is a long-term thing to look at as well. So we do use things like the Life and Time Survey to try and measure those attitudinal changes. But say at the behavioural level, a lot of the information can be quite anecdotal, but also just seeing, say, for example, the Developing Women in the Community project. The engagement with that we have seen clearly go up. We have got statistics of the number of women who have been engaged in that in phase 1, which I think was about 250, and the plan for phase 2 from December, I think, last year through to March next year, is aiming at just under 600, and we are seeing that engagement go up. But the long-term outcome is difficult to measure. And as far as how we have the governance of that, we talked earlier on about Dominic being on the overarching sponsor group, and I sit on a level below on the benefit realisation groups. One of the constant discussions that is happening there is about the data and how we get better data and how we use that data to ensure that the projects are being hopefully mainstreamed in the right areas, the right geographical places, and so on. So I think the methodology is right. But there's two levels of metrics: the project, which has some really good data on it, and the longer term, ultimately the outcomes of a safer community, which we're seeing the right trajectory, but is so difficult to measure.
I know. I mean, let's take an example. For example, reported incidents of violence. You could say on one level, a reduction in reported incidents of violence is a reflection on a more peaceful society. However, you could equally say that an increase in reports shows an increase in engagement and willingness by the communities to engage with the PSNI, which in itself is a good thing, because we know a lot of these problems are being contained within communities because of fear. So I appreciate the difficulty. Are you, in terms of getting that uniformity? All right, these programs are all different, and we're doing different things, but are you satisfied you've got a sort of overarching, uniform sort of way of measuring this that can be easily understood and will help inform policy making in the future?
So I am, and I think I would put it in the context of the NIO role. We're not leading the project, obviously. We're a key stakeholder in it. But I absolutely think the work that has been done is hugely useful, and the data that's been gathered is really helpful. We're coming to the end of phase 2 of the Tackling Paramilitarism programme, and actually there's a big decision as far as what happens next. And I do think, to answer your question, I think we have got the evidence base to inform those decisions. Now, is it the amount of data that we would wish to have? No, but that is the difficulty. But just if I can go back to your earlier point about how you kind of look at reporting and so on, I think you're absolutely right. One of the biggest issues I think we come across is how underreported things are. And actually the work to build community resilience, individual resilience, to encourage people to speak up and report these things, I actually would see that as a positive.
Agree. Thank you very much.
Anything else? No. Sir Robert Goodwill.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. think one of the ways that we can combat the way that some of these paramilitary groups are so embedded in their communities is to give young people alternatives, and alternatives through education, alternatives through employment. But of course there's always a danger that some of these groups may be masquerading as community groups when in fact they've got also roots within some of these paramilitary organisations. So what are we doing to ensure that all of this funding reaches the desired target and none of it's siphoned off into the sort of people we don't want to give any assistance to?
Yeah, I mean, we have, if I may ask Dominic to answer that particular question, because it's a fair point, and there's been the odd example in the past.
Yeah, it's a very fair point, and one that the TPP, the programme, spends a lot of time thinking about. I think there are two things I would draw out. The first is there's a short-term sort of expediency sometime in decisions that is problematic, where in order to make a short-term intervention in a particular community, that intervention relies on an individual or a group that doesn't have the long-term benefits of the community at heart. So, for example, is a gatekeeper for funding, but provides quite a convenient way of dealing with an acute problem in a particular circumstances. So the housing of a family, for example, under threat, where there is a temptation for programs to be targeted at individuals. So they're very conscious about that short-term problem. Longer term, there are a series of values that govern the program that are designed to get absolutely after the issue that you raised, to ensure that all the money is going to people who are fully committed to moving away from paramilitarism and see a different future for communities. We also have a risk framework in place for escalating the risks, because in some cases, without a little bit of risk, you don't always get the rewards. So sometimes people are operating on the borders of the risk, but there's a risk framework in place to make sure that the judgments for that are being made at the right level.
What degree of coordination has there been between the Northern Ireland office, the executive when we have one, and also I guess the Republic, because sometimes funds comes into groups from south of the border, to ensure that there is a consistent approach and that we know exactly where the money is being funneled? Yeah, so there is a lot of money being spent, and there is a risk that not every project is embedded in the ecosystem of tackling paramilitarism that we're talking about today. So we've just launched a bit of work actually to try and capture all that funding and ensure that that everybody is operating. Of course, they're operating to the same values that you would expect, but they have the requisite knowledge to make the right decisions about where the money is going. I mean, to be honest, a lot of the delivery is done by partners on the ground in Northern Ireland, and they know the lie of the land, far better than I or anybody else in the Northern Ireland office do, and that's one of the advantages of having delivery done there rather than here. But it's something that we really watch.
It's also something
the committee's seen some excellent work in community in Belfast, Londonderry, and elsewhere, where we can see community groups who really got the benefits to their community close to their heart. But there's always that risk. Do you think maybe in that regard, having a code of practice, a standard code of practice and behaviours that all community organisations should adhere to, and if any of them cross the line on that code of practice, they should not receive funding? Yep, so we do, for the TPP generally, as I say, we have the values document, which I can certainly let you have if you haven't seen it already, but for certain projects as well, we also have a contractual arrangement that enshrines those values contractually into the delivery agreement. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just on this budget issue and the community groups, etc. Is there scope, and Secretary of State, you may not be able to answer this directly and may need to go and think about it, but given the fact that we have heard, both in evidence and anecdotally in informal discussion and briefing, that there's quite a lot of projects which are teetering on the precipice of durability because of the absence of the executive and their element of funding coming in. Actually, some considerable praise, I have to say, we've heard for your department that has been where you have a percentage of funding to give, that's always been guaranteed and so on and so forth. So it's not a criticism of the NIO. But in order to allow those groups who are working in this particularly important space, tackling paramilitarism, supporting families and the like, is there scope for, in essence, de facto direct funding from Westminster, but with the concomitant top slicing from the block grant? So it was, if it had been made by the executive, but given the importance of the work, you did it. So it's not direct rule funding, it's in essence you acting, I suppose, for want of a better term, in loco parentis.
Yeah, I mean, so I've actually not been asked that question before, though there have been other guises where I've been asked by all the political party leaders to step in to do something that would normally be done by the executive. I'm very wary of that. The only times I've stepped in are either because I've had a legal duty to do so, or, as I say, all the political party leaders writing to me asking me to step in a certain, in Daffy's Law's case. In budgetary terms, I think that would be tremendously difficult to do. So it wouldn't be done. I mean, the method would be difficult to do more as much as well as the practice, and so I don't think that would be the best way forward.
Even in that very specific and narrow space of community activity focused solely on tackling the impact of paramilitaries. Given, as we know, what is a relative fragility, given the continued question marks over Windsor and the like, this work is always important, but it's particularly important now.
Yeah, and it would be. I mean, you would.
And I know one can carve out, but this is important, or that's important,
exactly right,
or this is important, and there is the slippery slope argument. I take that entirely.
I mean, we do have small bits of funding as the NIO that we, that, as you mentioned, we use. And James, if I may.
Yeah, so I think one of the big priorities for us at the moment on funding of community projects is looking forward to years 24-25 with the funding of the Tackling Paramilitarism programme. Yes. So we've been match funding at 8 million for recent years. We have, out of the SR21, we will be funding to 24-25 at 5 million, but that does leave a shortfall in comparison to previous years of the 3 million pounds. That is purely because of the funding stream there is slightly out of kilter, because the 3 million pounds comes from the New Decade, New Approach, Unique Circumstances pot, and because TPP Phase 2 is due to run out at the end of the next financial year, we are now starting to have that conversation. So I think that is the big priority for us.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Parry.
Thank you, Chair. It's back to me. Just coming back to the issue of transition that the Chair mentioned earlier, just maybe we could explore it a little bit more detail. Secretary of State, the first thing is there probably are potentially 3 strands of transition. You could talk about individual transition for a person who is in a paramilitary organisation, getting them out. Secondly, there's the issue then of group transition, the paramilitary structures themselves transitioning to something else, whatever that may be. And then thirdly is about communities in terms of transitioning away from the coercive control and getting more opportunities, etc. Where do you think the balance needs to lie across those 3 different potential strands?
Well, we're trying to get all 3, aren't we? I wouldn't like to think I'm not sure if there would ever be a correct balance, because it would depend community by community, group by group, and actually elements within each group that would be interested in moving quicker. So and projects exist for all three as well. So I guess the correct balance would be trying to get the biggest shift in transition for in the quickest possible time. But if there was a very simple formula to do that, we'd have done it ages ago.
I suppose of those three, the most controversial by far is the notion of group transition, from X to Y, and exactly what Y is going to be, and are there any incentives for that process. We're conscious that the Independent Reporting Commission have made some recommendations around group transition, though to be fair, that they are probably fairly ill-defined exactly what they are getting at in that process. Could you just clarify, have the government had any discussions with them around that recommendation, and also what is the government's view on what group transition should look like?
Yeah, so I have had conversations with the IRC, and they've done a huge amount of work actually in this space, which I truly welcome. Their idea of having an appointment of an independent person, or maybe even independent people, to carry out exploratory engagement on the issues of group transition is an interesting idea, and one that actually I've taken very seriously, and I've had lots of other conversations with. I actually I've tested the kind of wider views on the recommendation with all sorts of people, statutory and community partners in Northern Ireland, and actually discussed the issue and other aspects of the IRC's 4th and 5th reports with the Irish government at the October and January meetings of the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference. And we're continuing to talk about this because there seems to be a view that in trying to get group transition in the past, it's fallen down at different hurdles, and maybe having someone who is almost like the halfway house in the communication process to help guide and bring people who do want to go on this journey and help them through it. It'd be very difficult for them to go to someone actually who's in government and say, oh yeah, we want to, or in the policing service and say this. So having someone independent where that can point and help them to the right expertise. So there is value in it. I'm seriously looking at that recommendation actually.
Just maybe to slightly push back, or maybe to be fair, I mean, you haven't given a firm opinion either way on the issue, but do you see some of the potential pitfalls that people have raised around this? For example, if this involved money to paramilitaries in the context of what is very straitened time, how unfair that may seem to people. Secondly, the fear that this is simply disingenuous in the sense that it's just an organisation reforming under a different label, but maybe continuing some of the coercive control. And also, in communities that have been plagued by paramilitarism, how do you encourage other voices to come forward if they simply see what is one structure of oppression being transformed into something else, but still crowding out the community space for other voices who have always, shall we say, been law-abiding throughout their lives?
I hear your concerns here, but so the IRC recommendation on group transition is quite straightforward, and is one that I'd endorse. To go down this route, you would have to end recruitment to your group, you'd have to give up structures and activity, cease mobilisation of members, cease coercive power and control of communities, end paramilitary style attacks and all other types of violence, forms of violence, threat of violence or intimidation, dispose of any weaponry and material, allow people to exit your group without cost or consequence, and publicly support the PSNI and criminal justice system in tackling criminality and committing to democracy and the rule of law. So, and engaging with legacy bodies. So that, I think if you're willing to do that, I think we should be willing to allow these people to make that change.
Is there anything stopping anyone actually doing that transition of present in society? I mean, what are the barriers? I mean, this may be rather simplistic, but if you want to stop being a paramilitary, stop being a paramilitary.
Yeah, I mean, I I'm not the right person to answer that question because I cannot put my own mindset inside the head of a paramilitary person. So I don't know what the drivers are, or what I can guess, but I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Robin Walker wanted to come in and call the lock up. Robin.
I apologise for taking the conversation backwards a bit, but it was following the chairman's point about funding, and I know from experience how incredibly difficult and frustrating it can be to join up different pots of government funding, and particularly between the devolved and UK space. But we've had a really welcome announcement today in England around PE and sport premium, which is doing exactly that and providing a multi-year funding settlement, which has been long sought after and mechanistically very, very difficult to deliver. Due to the absence of an executive and the incredibly difficult position that you were put in over setting the Northern Irish budget, there are big cuts due to come through to education funding in Northern Ireland. Now, hopefully there will be some Barnett consequentials from today's announcement, which may help to some degree with that. But would you agree that actually looking to join up funding and provide multi-year settlements when it comes to both education and community sport and activity for young people is actually an important part of the solution for tackling paramilitarism and providing diversion from those young people getting drawn into the criminal networks that are there? And is there anything you feel that's in your power to encourage that and foster that? I absolutely accept the first element of that is bring back the executive.
I mean, the answer to the bulk of your question is yes. I think you're absolutely right. Multi-year funding for organisations and in the community sport is nigh on vital, and it does help planning, and it means that everybody understands the parameters within what they're working, and I've met so many, I mean, just in my constituency, let alone in Northern Ireland, groups that, in fact, from an English constituency point of view, today's announcement is a truly good announcement. And then you look at it in the Northern Ireland context and you think, yes, what you would like to see is a similar announcement after a period of time of working through the issues of the budget in that space. And so it is one for the executive, but I agree with you entirely on the value of multi-year funding for organisations like this, and so they don't have to be looking over their shoulder for a period of time and can look forwards to what they're delivering on the job they're meant to be doing.
Thank you. Carla.
Okay, and again, it's maybe slightly off topic, but just keen, I've recently asked a couple of questions, written questions, of your good office around the 2015 paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland report. And I'm going to try again because I haven't been able to get an answer. And I'd just be keen to know what your assessment is of the links between the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin as determined in that report in 2015, and are those links still in existence?
I believe. Go on, James. I think you know the answer. I don't.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is assessment of any paramilitary activity is a responsibility of MI5 and PSNI, so it's not one I feel that I'm well placed to comment on. I think the circumstances of the 2015 assessment were very unique at that time, and there was no commitment by the Secretary of State at the time to repeat that public assessment. So I'm comfortable that we get regular classified assessments of paramilitary activity from MI5 and PSNI, but as with assessments of that ilk across the national security community and GB as well, they are classified reports.
Okay, thank you.
But my understanding is that was a report done by the Northern Ireland office and was published back in 2015. I wasn't.
The 2015 report. It was commissioned by the then Secretary of State, but it was written by PSNI and MI5.
So if it was commissioned by the Secretary of State, then can we seek assurances that the Secretary of State will look into this issue, because ultimately what we've seen recently is a number of issues around a search in North Belfast where there were provisional IRA clothing found. So if the links between Sinn Féin and the provisional IRA still exist, as indicated in the 2015, because there's been nothing to say that they don't, it's very serious. So I would be wondering what investigations are being taken into that, and also around the Dodal case in Dublin, around Dublin crime gangs and the money that's being used there.
So the assessment was done in unique circumstances in 2015. I'm yet to see similar circumstances that would lead to be doing another assessment.
I was about to say, I don't think it's fair to ask either the Secretary of State or his colleagues to comment upon anything which is either ongoing or in hand for clear and obvious reasons. But I'm sure you'll follow it up with the Secretary of State if required. Secretary of State, colleagues, can I thank you very much indeed for your attendance this morning. A difficult session, I suppose, given the issue at hand, but clear action needed, and we're very grateful to you for taking the time to answer our questions and share with us your thinking on a variety of those important issues. Order.
Thank you.
Committee Room 16, sound. 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 Committee Room 16, sound.